She called him her forgettable ex, the man who fetched coffee and filed papers. But when he stood up at her engagement party and spoke just 2 words, the music stopped, and so did her perfect world. Hey everyone, welcome back, and thanks again for being here. I've got something new for you today, something that still feels surreal even as I replay it in my head. Let me take you into it. He stood quietly at the edge of the ballroom, unnoticed, tucked behind the towering floral arrangements and champagne towers. The same man she once dismissed as insignificant, a nobody really, was now watching her bask in the spotlight, glowing in a gold designer gown, wrapped around the arm of her billionaire fiancé. But when she spotted him in the crowd and tried to embarrass him by calling him her old secretary, something shifted. He calmly uttered just 2 words, simple, quiet, but sharp as glass. Words that cut through the buzz of conversation, silenced the string quartet mid-note, and made her picture-perfect world begin to crumble. Were those 2 words federal prosecutor? Before we dive deeper, go ahead and give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. This one's about heartbreak, betrayal, and the sting of being underestimated. We appreciate every one of you who tunes in. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now let's get into it. The chandeliers hanging from the ceiling seemed to shimmer with secrets of their own, casting little sparks of light like gossip whispered in crystal. Ethan Callahan stood near the grand entrance of the Whitmore Estate ballroom, subtly adjusting the cuffs of his deep navy suit. He wasn't trying to draw attention, and yet the weight of his presence felt deliberate. Around him, the wealthy elite mingled beneath the glimmering lights, women in designer gowns that dripped elegance, men in sharp tuxedos with polished shoes and fake laughs, champagne flutes clinking like wind chimes in a breeze. But Ethan wasn't there for the party. He wasn't there to toast to love or wealth. He was there for her. He came to see the woman who once shared his life, his mornings, his dinners, his late-night dreams. The same woman who used to tell him he was too quiet, too cautious, not bold enough for her fast-paced world. The woman who left him with nothing but silence and a lie that she never looked back on. Delilah Monroe. Tonight, she looked like a masterpiece, draped in gold, poised like a queen, detached from everything real. The way she held herself, the way her gown caught every bit of light in the room, it was mesmerizing and painful all at once. Her hand rested lightly on the chest of her new fiancé, Chase Whitmore. The man had the kind of charm that sold movie tickets and the wealth to buy a continent. He smiled like someone who thought he'd won. Delilah laughed, clear, loud, like it belonged in a perfume commercial. That laugh used to be Ethan's comfort. It once filled his living room, made bad days better. Now it carved into him like ice. The bitter truth? She'd rewritten his story to make herself the heroine. Told people he was just a desk jockey, a nameless assistant, the guy who fetched coffee while she chased big dreams and brighter lights. And now here they were, face to face again, though neither of them expected this moment to come. And there she stood now, radiant under the golden lights, soaking in every bit of attention from a crowd gathered just for her. She didn't know that the man she once tried to erase from her story had quietly stepped back into her world, not to chase her, not to seek closure, but simply to be, completely, confidently, unapologetically. Ethan watched from the shadows with the patience of someone who'd lived this scene before. He knew every expression she'd make, every smile just a little too wide, every glance too perfectly placed. It was like watching a performance he had seen one too many times. Her charm was choreographed now, flawless on the surface but empty underneath. He remembered a very different version of Delilah. The woman who woke up with tangled hair and yesterday's eyeliner smudged across her cheek. The woman who used to bury her face into his chest, shaking with quiet sobs after another investor pulled out, another pitch failed. He remembered carrying the weight when she couldn't, footing rent payments when her account hit zero, cooking midnight pasta while she rehearsed her pitch lines in front of the mirror like her life depended on them. That raw, fragile woman, the one he had loved without question, was nowhere in this ballroom tonight. He stayed partially veiled in the crowd on purpose. He wasn't ready to be seen until he was. And when he took just one step forward, it was like the air changed. Conversations paused. Eyes shifted. There was a flicker, brief but visible, in the gaze of her cousin, the one who used to roll her eyes at him, and the smug friend who once jokingly called him, assistant guy. They recognized him, but something was different. They couldn't place the reason for the shift in energy, but that didn't matter. They would understand soon enough. Because Ethan wasn't hiding anymore. And then it happened. Delilah stepped up onto the stage, the spotlight finding her like it had been waiting just for her moment. She stood tall, her voice sweet and practiced as she welcomed the crowd with syrupy sincerity. She gushed about gratitude, about new beginnings and love stories. And just as he'd expected, right on cue, she turned her act in his direction. "And over there," she said, all sugar and performance, her arm gesturing toward him with a knowing smirk, "is someone from my past. Ethan Callahan, my ex-husband. I assume he's still somewhere in Washington, probably color-coding file folders and making sure the coffee machine works." The laughter that followed was sharp and rehearsed, like glass breaking politely. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he calmly lifted his glass of water, locked eyes with her, and held her gaze like he was reading straight through her soul. For a moment, just a brief heartbeat, the laughter around her stuttered. Something was off and she felt it. Because she didn't know. The guests didn't know who he was now. They had no idea about the courtroom battles he'd won, the cases with headlines sealed by federal confidentiality, the operations that required his clearance and his signature. They didn't know about the indictments, the weight of national secrets he carried while she was busy writing captions about healing energy and finding your sparkle. She never once asked what he did after their divorce. Never cared. But tonight that was going to change. The moment finally arrived when Chase made his way over, weaving through the murmuring crowd with a polished grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He extended a hand like it was all part of the show. "So Ethan," he said smoothly, voice casual and curious, "remind me, what is it you do again?" Ethan's eyes didn't go to Chase. They landed on Delilah. And there it was, that familiar glint in her gaze. She was waiting for it. Waiting for the laugh, the punchline she'd long rehearsed about the ex who never amounted to anything, who stayed tucked behind a desk while she soared. But Ethan didn't give her the story she wanted. "Federal prosecutor," he said clearly with no embellishment and no apology. In that instant, something in the air shifted like a curtain had been yanked aside. The subtle hum of background laughter vanished. It was as if the room inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Delilah's champagne flute slipped from her fingers. The glass hit the marble floor and shattered, its echo cutting through the silence sharper than any scream. And just like that, the unraveling began. There was no explosion of emotion. No dramatic outburst or whispered argument. Just a silence so deep it seemed to wrap around everyone in the room, pressing down until it became impossible to ignore. It was the kind of silence that strips away pretenses and forces people to really see, to hear not just what was said but how it was said and why it mattered. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and, without fanfare, handed Chase a card. "Ethan Callahan, U.S. Department of Justice. Major Fraud Division." The weight of that little rectangle of cardstock landed harder than any mic drop. Delilah's face went pale, her lips parting like she might say something, but the words caught in her throat. She tried to summon a laugh, something light, something to wave the moment away, but the sound never came. Even Chase's smile had faded. He was staring at her now with something new in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even suspicion. The story had changed. The illusion she'd crafted, that shiny version of her past, had cracked right down the middle. And through that crack Ethan stepped forward, not to make a scene but simply to exist. Unapologetically. Confidently. Quietly. The ballroom, once alive with music and polished laughter, seemed to freeze. The chandeliers stopped shimmering. The air held its breath. Ethan Callahan didn't need to say another word. He already had. And those two words, federal prosecutor, still echoed under the high ceilings like a dropped blade no one dared to pick up. Delilah Monroe stood rigid beside Chase Whitmore, her golden dress suddenly too bright, too loud, as if it belonged to someone else. Her confidence, once towering, was folding in on itself under the weight of a truth she had never imagined confronting in this way. A moment ago she held the stage. Every eye followed her. Now the room belonged to Ethan. Someone in the crowd cleared their throat. A waiter stopped mid-step, not sure whether to keep moving. A glass clinked too hard onto a tray in the corner. Even the jazz quartet had fallen silent. Now the room looked around awkwardly, caught between frozen tension and polite confusion. Conversations had stalled mid-sentence. Music remained suspended. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer. No one quite knew how to restart the celebration. Delilah crouched to the floor, pretending to clean up the shattered remains of her champagne glass, her hand gripping a napkin as though the pieces might cut her if she let them go. But her trembling fingers gave her away. The act was thin, the mask already slipping. Chase rested a hand gently on the small of her back, a move that seemed more instinct than affection. He looked back at Ethan with a cautious expression, his voice unsure now. "You're with the Department of Justice?" he asked slowly, still trying to make sense of it. But she said, "I mean, she told me you worked in administration." Ethan gave a small nod, tilting his head with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's one version of the story. Delilah rose unsteadily, trying to recapture her grace. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin. It wasn't a lie, she said quickly, too quickly. Her voice had a brittle edge to it, like glass under pressure. Ethan never really explained what he did. Things were distant toward the end. I didn't ask and he didn't exactly offer. But Chase was already seeing through it. His eyes narrowed and whatever warmth had been there was cooling fast. He didn't say anything but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't believe her. Not anymore. Ethan didn't feel the need to argue. He didn't have to. Instead, he turned his gaze on the crowd. The cousins, the former friends, the co-workers who had all embraced Delilah's version of the story. People who'd nodded along to her glamorous half-truths without ever questioning the quiet man she left behind. Those same faces now looked different, smaller somehow. They weren't laughing anymore. They were recalculating, reassessing. And it wasn't just that Ethan had changed. It was that they were finally seeing Delilah without her lighting cues, without her costume of curated perfection. He turned his attention back to Chase. I lead federal investigations into complex financial crimes, he said plainly. In the last 4 years I've been the lead prosecutor on 5 major cases. One of them involved your father's former business partner, if I remember correctly. Chase's expression stiffened. His lips pressed into a line, jaw tightening with sudden realization. Ethan remained still. While Delilah was chasing cameras and hashtags, he added softly, I was chasing the truth. Delilah let out a shaky laugh, brittle and desperate, trying to steer the conversation back into safe territory. Can we not do this here? She asked, glancing around nervously. This isn't a courtroom, it's a party. But you're the one who called the jury, Ethan replied, voice calm and level. You handed them the mic. Then you invited them to laugh. And now no one was laughing. The guests stood watching, motionless. Champagne flutes untouched. Even the ones who'd laughed the loudest at her secretary jab were suddenly silent, their gazes lowered to their polished shoes. Chase's face hardened. He turned toward Delilah, disbelief growing in his eyes. You told me he organized office supplies. She said you didn't have ambition, Chase muttered, the words falling heavy in the quiet. That you weren't going anywhere. That you didn't matter. Delilah opened her mouth, reaching for a defense that wasn't there. I didn't mean it like, she began, stepping toward Ethan as if closing the space between them might undo what had just unraveled. Ethan took a slow step back, calm and firm. You said you'd outgrown him, Chase said, his voice lower now, eyes not on Ethan but on her. But what I see is, you made him small first. Delilah's lips moved but no words followed. The spotlight had shifted and she wasn't ready for the weight of it. I'm not here to fight, Ethan said, stepping gently back, away from the center of attention. I came because I was invited. And I figured, for once, it might be good for people to actually know who I am. He turned toward the bar, not with drama or flair, but with quiet resolve, leaving the silence behind to speak for him. And it did loudly. Behind him, Delilah stood motionless, gripping her purse like it was the last thing holding her upright. Her face was tight, her confidence visibly fraying. Around her, people began to stir again, but they weren't moving toward her. They were drifting in Ethan's direction now. The tide had turned. Later in the evening, Ethan stood near the back of the ballroom, a quiet observer as Delilah's carefully constructed image began to fray under the weight of its own fiction. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just watched with a calm detachment that only made the contrast starker. Guests were avoiding Delilah now, not in a dramatic or overt way, but with small, unmistakable hesitations. A couple who'd once championed her success slipped past without a glance. Her sister, Jenna, lingered nearby, arms folded tight, her face stormy with hesitation, torn between loyalty and the urge to separate from the fallout. Even her father, Franklin Monroe, who once called Ethan invisible at family dinners, sat near the exit, stiff and pale, eyes fixed on the floor. The man who used to treat him like an afterthought couldn't bring himself to make eye contact now. This had moved beyond embarrassment. It was transformation. And the hardest part for Ethan wasn't watching it unfold, it was realizing how long he'd let them believe the lie. Around the ballroom, conversations had shifted completely. He prosecuted the Milford fraud case, right? Someone whispered. I saw him in that Bloomberg segment last month, another replied, disbelief clear in their voice. She said he was a file clerk. Just some guy who ran errands. Delilah heard every single word. And each one scorched her a little more. Eventually, Chase found Ethan again, No fake charm this time, no rehearsed friendliness. Just a man who looked tired. Disappointed. She lied to all of us, he said quietly. Even about how you two met. Ethan said nothing, but his silence welcomed the truth. She said, "You were convenient." Ethan didn't even blink. He wasn't surprised by Chase's words. He'd heard versions of them before. She needed someone quiet enough to make her feel louder, he said simply, with no bitterness, just truth. Chase exhaled slowly, shoulders slumping a little under the weight of realization. "I can't believe I didn't see it." "You weren't supposed to," Ethan replied, his voice calm. "That's how illusions work. You only see what they want you to see." Chase fell silent, eyes cast downward, like he was replaying every conversation, every assumption. After a long pause, he finally spoke again, quieter this time, almost ashamed. "I didn't realize you were the DOJ's lead on the Westmore Securities case. That was all over the news." Ethan gave a small nod. He wasn't there for recognition, but he didn't deny it either. "She said you were still chasing assistant-level promotions," Chase added, shaking his head. "She said a lot of things." "Why didn't you ever correct her?" he asked, puzzled. Ethan took a slow sip of his water before answering. "Because I never expected to be put on trial at someone else's engagement party." Chase let out a short, dry laugh, a mix of regret and disbelief. "She told me you were boring." "I was consistent," Ethan said without hesitation. "She said you never fought for her," Chase added, almost reflexively. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "She confused stability with weakness. But tonight she learned. When the quiet man finally speaks, the room listens." Chase followed Ethan's gaze across the room. There, in the far corner, Delilah sat alone on a plush velvet bench, staring into the light of her phone screen, her fingers twitching, swiping at nothing. For once, she wasn't performing. She looked small, uncertain. As if she was scrolling for a version of herself she couldn't find anymore. And Ethan? He didn't go to her. He didn't need to. By the bar, Lorraine Whitmore, Chase's mother, stood quietly beside Ethan. She studied him for a moment, then leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't raise your voice once," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, curious but silent. "And yet," she continued, "you've managed to turn this entire room upside down." He offered a faint smile. "The truth doesn't have to shout." She nodded thoughtfully, her eyes still on him. "You didn't come here to destroy her." "No," he said gently. "You came to remind her, and the rest of them, that they never really saw you at all. That," she said with a quiet finality, "is a rare kind of strength, Mr. Callahan." And with that she walked away, heels clicking softly across the marble floor, leaving Ethan alone beneath the shimmering chandelier. So, composed. Finally seen. Across the room, Delilah lifted her eyes. For the first time all evening, she wasn't trying to catch the spotlight. She was watching him. Not as the center of attention anymore, but as someone desperate. For understanding, for redemption, maybe even for rescue. But it wasn't her story now. Not anymore. It never was. The ballroom hadn't dimmed because the lights had been turned down, but because something in the air had shifted. A kind of weight had settled over the room. The heaviness that follows after something carefully crafted breaks in front of everyone. The silence was the loudest part. Delilah Monroe, once the radiant star of every room she entered, now stood dimmed. Not in appearance, her golden gown still shimmered, but it caught less light now, or perhaps she simply wore it differently. Her smile, once automatic and dazzling, had gone rigid. Her expressions were stiff, rehearsed, like a performer unsure if the curtain had closed. The woman who once soaked up attention with ease now found herself suffocating in the very silence she'd never learned to sit with. Across the room, Ethan stood beside a marble column, arms loosely crossed over his chest, his posture relaxed but unshakable. His eyes moved slowly over the crowd, not to gloat, not to seek approval, but just observing, steady, still. He wasn't proud in the way some men might be. He wasn't smug or triumphant. He simply was. And that, somehow, was louder than any speech. The entire atmosphere had begun to shift around him. The man they'd once laughed off earlier in the evening had become something they couldn't look away from, something that unsettled them, challenged the assumptions they'd all comfortably held. He felt their eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others burdened with guilt. Conversations, once buzzing with easy laughter and glittery gossip, had grown hushed. People leaned closer to one another, whispering behind raised glasses. Every few moments, someone would glance over at Delilah, then look away just as quickly, like they'd peeked behind the curtain and didn't know what to do with what they saw. Even Jenna, her sister, who used to roll her eyes at Ethan across crowded dinner tables, now stood at the outskirts of the room, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched. She was clearly weighing things in her head, whether to stand by her sister or to brace for the collapse. Then a man in a navy blazer approached Ethan, cautiously, like he was stepping into sacred ground. "You really led the Milford fraud case?" he asked, voice barely above the music. Ethan gave a small nod. "She told us you filed paperwork," the man added, confused. "I did," Ethan replied with just a flicker of a smile. "Right after filing federal indictments." The man blinked a few times and quietly backed away, returning to the crowd. At the dessert table, Delilah's father, Franklin Monroe, sat alone, slouched just slightly in his seat. This was the same man who had once introduced Ethan as Delilah's ride, or the guy who drops her off at work. Now he was just watching. His face unreadable, mouth drawn tight. But beneath the stillness, something else stirred. Shame maybe. Regret. Fear. Or a mix of all three. He didn't say a word. Because there was nothing left to say. Delilah had rewritten the truth for everyone. She had recast Ethan as a background character in her own sparkling story. A prop. A placeholder. A name not worth remembering. But now, there he was. In a sharp suit. Unapologetically standing in the same room that once dismissed him. No vengeance. No spectacle. Just truth. And it was undoing years of fiction with nothing more than presence. Ethan didn't go to him. He didn't have to. Just being there, present, grounded, unmistakably himself, was enough. Meanwhile, at the bar, Chase Whitmore sat motionless, his drink untouched in front of him. He hadn't spoken much since the truth came crashing down. His fingers tapped lightly against the rim of his glass, a slow, uncertain rhythm. His thoughts were clearly tangled, trying to sort through the mess without unraveling. Then came the sound of heels, measured but nervous. Delilah approached slowly, the confident strut she once wore like armor now reduced to cautious steps on marble. She reached out and gently rested her hand on Chase's shoulder. "Can we talk?" she asked, voice soft and unsure. Chase turned to face her, but the warmth that had once lit up his eyes was gone. His expression was still and his voice was steady, but cold. "You didn't just lie to me," he said quietly, "you made me part of the lie." Delilah's breath caught. "I didn't mean." "You used him," Chase cut in, his words sharper now. "You turned him into a joke. In front of all these people. And for what? To look bigger?" She opened her mouth but nothing came out. "I believed you," he said, eyes narrowing. "I defended your version of who he was. You made me believe I knew the truth, and now I look like a fool." Her lips parted again, searching for a reply, but the silence between them swallowed whatever story she was about to reach for. Because this time, no version of the truth would save her. There was no angle, no narrative she could spin. Not now. Her eyes drifted across the ballroom toward the man she once loved, and underestimated. Ethan. Still composed. Still calm. Still whole. He didn't smile. Didn't speak. He just met her gaze with a steady calm, and for the first time she saw him, not as the reserved man lingering in the background, not as the character she edited down to a footnote, but as someone she could never shrink again. Later that night, as the final guests shuffled out and laughter faded to murmurs, Ethan stepped out onto the front steps of the estate. The night air was crisp, clean. Nothing like the thick, staged atmosphere of the ballroom. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the breeze wash over him, brushing past the collar of his jacket. It felt real. Then a voice behind him broke the quiet. "Ethan." He turned. It was Jenna Monroe. Her expression was sharp, her posture guarded. But there was no mockery in her voice now. "I just wanted to say," she paused, searching for the right words. "You made your point." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jenna hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "I thought you were just background noise. Weak. Temporary. A placeholder." She swallowed hard. "Now I get it. You weren't weak. You were just quiet." Ethan gave her a single, steady nod. Quiet doesn't mean small. And with that, he turned back toward the night. Finally seen. Finally understood. And no longer silent. Jenna stared at him for a long moment, expression unreadable, then without another word she turned and walked back inside. Ethan didn't follow. He didn't feel the need to explain or smooth things over anymore. He'd spent too many years letting other people tell his story, define his worth. Tonight he let the truth speak for itself. And for the first time they listened. Inside, the party was trying to find its rhythm again, like a house trying to breathe after a long storm. A new playlist flowed softly through the hidden speakers, upbeat but hesitant, like the sound itself wasn't quite sure it belonged anymore. Laughter returned, but it wasn't the same. It was thinner now. Less joyful, more rehearsed, the kind of laughter people use to distract, not to heal. To mask discomfort, not escape it. Waiters circled with dessert trays, camera flashes flickered around influencers and family friends desperate to capture moments that felt more normal than they were. But in the corner, Delilah Monroe sat alone, twisting the edge of a linen napkin around her fingers like it could anchor her in place. No one was lining up to congratulate her now. No one was asking for her story. Across the room, Ethan remained where he'd been most of the night, quiet, still, present. He hadn't said much since the truth was revealed. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than any monologue Delilah had ever delivered with a champagne flute in her hand. It spoke louder than any spotlight she'd ever stood beneath. And then, unexpectedly, Franklin Monroe approached. The same man who once snubbed Ethan at a charity gala, refusing to shake his hand. The same man who had once referred to him as the quiet one, as if that were a failing. Now Franklin moved stiffly, his jaw set tight, his steps deliberate. "Ethan," he said low and forced. Ethan looked up calmly. "Mr. Monroe." There was a pause, long, stretching between them like a chasm neither had tried to cross before. "I misjudged you," Franklin finally admitted, voice tight. Ethan tilted his head slightly, no malice in his tone. "You didn't judge me, sir. You judged the story she told you." Franklin's eyes flicked away for a moment. "Still, I should have known better." "You believed what made her shine," Ethan replied evenly. "But you never stopped to ask if the light she stood in belonged to someone else." Franklin didn't respond. There was nothing left to defend. He gave a quick, almost apologetic nod and quietly turned away. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and the ballroom began to empty into the night, Chase found Ethan again, this time out on a quiet balcony overlooking the city skyline. The lights below sparkled with quiet certainty. The air was cool and real, unfiltered by chandeliers or performances. "I'm ending it," Chase said, voice flat and certain. Ethan didn't react. No surprise. No judgment. Chase leaned on the railing beside him and exhaled, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. "She built an entire version of you. Sold it to everyone around her. And I believed it. I told people you were the kind of guy who couldn't think past a cubicle." Ethan's voice, when it came, was soft and even. "That's what she needed to believe." Chase turned to study him. "Why didn't you ever defend yourself?" Ethan's eyes stayed on the skyline. "Because truth doesn't need to run. It waits. It just waits." Ethan's words lingered in the cool air, soft but undeniable. Chase looked down at his hands, still absorbing everything. "She used you," he said finally, "to make herself look bigger." Ethan gave a soft, almost weary shrug. "She only looked tall because I stayed on my knees." Chase blinked. The sentence landed with a quiet, crushing force. No drama, just undeniable truth. Then, after a long pause, Chase asked something Ethan hadn't expected. "Did you still love her?" Ethan didn't answer right away. His gaze turned back to the horizon, where the city sparkled in quiet indifference. "I loved the woman I thought she was," he said finally. "But she loved the reflection of herself in my silence." Chase nodded, slowly, as if every word stitched something back together inside him. "She's going to hate that she didn't break you." "She never had that kind of power," Ethan replied, voice calm, solid. Then, quietly, Chase extended his hand, not as an introduction but as a gesture of something deeper. "Respect." "Thank you," he said, voice low, "for not tearing her apart. You could have." "I didn't have to," Ethan replied, his tone quiet but resolute. "She did that herself." Back inside, Delilah made one final attempt. Her heels clicked softly across the floor, no longer confident, just tentative, uneven. She approached him slowly, her voice barely more than a breath. "Ethan." He didn't move. "I didn't know who you really were." He met her eyes, steady and clear. "No," he said. "You just didn't care to." Delilah's breath caught in her throat. "I thought I needed more." "You needed noise," Ethan said without anger. "And I gave you calm." She swallowed, eyes flicking downward. "Can we talk? Just the two of us?" Ethan shook his head gently. "No, Delilah," he said. "You didn't invite me here to talk. You invited me to be the punchline." Her eyes shimmered, voice cracking. "You're different now." He looked at her, no longer the man she once thought she knew. "No," he said simply. "I'm just not quiet anymore." She stood there, lips parted, trembling, For once, not because she wanted to speak, but because she finally couldn't. No words. No spin. No final performance. Ethan didn't wait for Delilah to recover, didn't give her space to launch one last dramatic plea. Maybe Jenna had more to say. Maybe even Franklin Monroe had a new version of the truth he wanted to share. But none of that mattered now. Ethan glanced one last time toward the far corner of the ballroom. There sat Delilah, still dressed in gold but somehow dimmer than before. She clutched her phone like it might tether her back to relevance. But the audience was gone. The story was over. There were no more lines to recite, no more eyes watching, no applause left to chase. For the first time in a long time she wasn't performing. It was just her. And in that silence, Ethan turned and walked slowly toward the exit. A few guests paused to stop him on the way out. Some muttered quiet apologies. Others offered nods, simple, respectful, wordless acknowledgments. None of them had seen him before tonight. Not really. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Jenna. She just wants a minute. Buzz. Again. Franklin Monroe this time. You deserve better. I owe you a real conversation. That one made him smile, but not the way he used to smile when Delilah made sweet-sounding promises she never meant to keep. No, this was different. This was the smile of a man who finally understood something deep. That closure never comes from people who tried to write you out of your own story. It comes from standing up and staying standing. Ethan placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. As the estate disappeared in his rearview mirror, he didn't look back. He didn't need to yell. He only needed to be heard. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us through this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take. And if this one moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.